How's it going, Publius?
It's going, Maud. How are you? I don't
I'm
really have
doing.
my voice, otherwise, nothing to complain about.
You said you don't have your voice.
Yeah, I apologize for that.
I think we can hear you well, but hope for a speedy recovery, nevertheless.
Uh, All right, well, as long as I'm loud and clear and understandable, then we're ready to go.
Yeah. And Person says they missed the robot voice or the voice modulator. All right, to those with us, feel free to drop your questions at the town hall chat, or even better, join us on stage. I'm gonna give it some time, see if folks want to gather some thoughts or questions, and we can discuss them or answer them. And we'll start with Harry Smith, where they ask when Wells, if there are any updates on Wells, Publius.
So no real update on the well timing, but do feel like from an infrastructure perspective, things are getting much closer to wells, or wells are getting closer to being ready for audit. So a lot of what's happening across Beanstalk Farms and what Publius is working on for really December, and Halborn is also working on, is dramatically improving the documentation in the contracts and around Beanstalk, such that when things that are as complex as wells are implemented and audited and published, hopefully the standards of documentation that have been put in place over the next month, let's call it, will be sufficient such that everyone involved in the process understands exactly what the code is supposed to do and not do. And hopefully that will create a safe environment for the deployment of wells and pumps and aqueducts, which are going to be collectively very complex codes. So at a high level, feel like a lot of the groundwork for relatively timely and God willing safe deployment of wells, a lot of that work is currently being done. And so hopefully in the beginning of Q1, wells will be ready for audit and be ready for audit in according to the new and updated documentation standards, such that everyone that reviews the code from the time that it's done until the time that it's pushed on chain or proposed as a BIP is able to get a really clear sense of exactly what all of it is supposed to do. And again, given the complexity of wells, pumps, and aqueducts, we feel like this is very important and should actually allow for things to start to run a lot more quickly come the new year.
Okay, and as a reminder, when it comes to updates, there is a BIP 30 that's currently live, and this BIP is to introduce the generalized pipeline and a few other updates to Beanstalk, including updating the sunrise reward.
And Harry, see you with the little crying emoji in the chat. And so would just say that one thing that is actively being considered and trying to be scoped out is what it would look like to have a Bean ETH well, pump, and aqueduct ready to go for audit in the very beginning of the new year, and then push back slightly the timeline for fully generalized wells, pumps, and aqueducts, but feel like given the market circumstance, that may be something worth expediting slightly, but not exactly sure how much at the margin that will make a difference. And so we'll evaluate that kind of and continue to optimize in real time. But we're highly focused on getting a Bean ETH pool live as well in the next couple of months, let's call it, in a safe fashion. But and this is just an opinion. Don't really feel like at the margin, ETH is going to bottom out in the next 4 to 6 weeks, let's call it. Or if it does, it's like the marginal couple weeks. It's hard to imagine really costing Beanstalk. So with that said, not that speculating on ETH is really what we like to be doing during class. The reason for the comment is that we really do view doing everything in a secure or as secure fashion as possible as paramount. And hopefully very soon, whether it's January, February, very, very soon, all of the code for the Beneath Wells will be ready for audit. And then separately, it is worth noting that there is hopefully going to be a slightly more thorough pre-publishing audit process, both from Halborn, including the Immunify Bounty program before BIPs are published, et cetera, such that even if the code is ready early in Q1, it may not be until towards the middle of the quarter that things can actually be pushed on chain. So we're still talking a couple of months for better or worse, and therefore still working on this end as fast as possible to get that stuff ready, but understand where the rush is coming from.
Thank you, Publius. Okay, Publius, I have a question of my own. And that maybe we're revisiting a previous idea about the different seeds for different assets in Beanstalk. And right now we're talking about LB tokens and beans. And maybe I can start this with discussing the state of Beanstalk, or the state that Beanstalk is at right now. So the price of bean is 97 cents or around that. The field, or the temperature of the field, is increasing in order to sell soil or attract demand for soil. And then one thing notably that's maybe not happening, or participants elect not to do it, is convert. The converters or depositors in the silo can regain peg, but they choose not to. And maybe one of the things that's leading to that is the friction of having 4 seeds and going to 2 seeds. So we go back again to that discussion, and I wanted your thoughts on this. Is this friction really a bug, or is it a feature? Can this not be looked at as a good thing, that the protocol incentive is drawn in such a way that depositors prefer to hold their liquidity rather, or they give some value to holding it rather than always regaining peg?
It's definitely somewhere in between. And words like bugs and features may not do justice to the nuance here, which is let's take the perfect case. What would Beanstalk want in a perfect world? In theory, Beanstalk would have some optimal deviation from the peg, both in terms of magnitude of the price deviation, and in theory, you could also think of time as the other axis. So the price movement from peg and the time that the deviations take. And you can think of the magnitude of the price deviations, the order of magnitude of the time deviations. These are perhaps the primary things that Beanstalk would want to optimize around, and changing the temperature and changing the seeds per BDV in a perfect world are probably functions of that data, right? So it's not currently Beanstalk uses the current price or the current delta B, the current debt level, and the change in demand for soil. But in theory, at the price level and the debt level, you could introduce not just magnitude, but also time into the calculus. And at that point, the question, the nuance becomes more apparent, which is that what is being optimized around, or should be optimized around, perhaps isn't just a price deviation, but also the magnitude of the price deviations, the time of the price deviations, and similarly the magnitude of the debt level deviations and the time of them. And once you get into those questions, to be frank, feel like the modeling necessary to figure out what are the appropriate changes for Beanstalk to make to the seeds for BDV and the temperature, it becomes very complex very, very quickly. And therefore, it's probably not going to all be implemented day one when the gauge system is implemented, somewhat obviously. But the point is that if we think about that as the ideal, then the question becomes, well, what, assuming that the seeds per BDV and the stock per BDV can be flexible, what should they be functions of? And perhaps they start to work like the temperature works, where there's basic limits to it, and they change somewhat basically or stupidly up and down based on some input data like the price and the debt level, raw data. But perhaps the magnitude of the changes can become they can be much more sophisticated depending on the deviations from the optimal equilibrium, which again is the price at peg and the debt level at its optimal level. So it's a very interesting question. To be frank, the upgrades for the silo that will facilitate changing seeds per BDV, that's still, hopefully going to be ready in Q1. And at that point in time, then hopefully that will be implemented in a sufficiently generalized way, where then upgrading the equations that are calculating the seeds per BDV, that is a much simpler dev change and more of a complex economics question, if that makes sense. So that economics question remains totally unanswered from our perspective as to what the right way to make those changes are in response to that data. And it's definitely an interesting thing to think about and worthy of more study.
I think it's very interesting, the idea of having seeds, float or change according to some curve. Publius, maybe two questions here. One is, how do you see the DAO, or I guess the DAO coming into agreement on what what that pricing would be? And then maybe the second question is, do you foresee multiple pools with different maybe seeds functions? So you'll have a bean-3 curve, multiple bean-3 curve pools that follow different seed formulas, let's say, all approved by the DAO.
So I think let's answer the second question first, which is, in the context of Wells, the providing liquidity in Wells is most closely, effectively like an NFT, because each of the wells will be pretty customizable. And so in practice, the seeds per BDV will not be a function of the LP tokens themselves, but likely be a function of the base assets that are in the like effectively the BDV of the assets, and what that looks like in the wells if you load up USDC or some combination of non-bean assets is effectively the price at which you're willing to buy the beans at. And the point is that everything gets normalized to BDV, and at that point the only question is, what is the seeds per BDV? And that function can be somewhat arbitrary logic, but don't think that in reality it'll make sense to have multiple seed per BDV functions for the same token, because in practice the tokens that are going to be valued and have BDV functions are going to be like the base assets that trade against beans, and in practice the liquidity. I mean, maybe it's the same thing, right? If frankly, it's unclear exactly how that will work, but probably not. But again, it may in practice be the same thing, depending on who it's architected. And don't think we've gotten that far in the dev process to give you an answer. Although maybe if Publius is here and they have an answer, feel free to hop up, but don't think they are. And then you want to remind me of your first question, Mod? It was around how the DAO can go about setting those
Yes.
values. Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think it depends on what type of function is being used. So currently, the seeds per BDV are just fixed values. So 2 seeds per BDV, 4 seeds per BDV. But if the concept is that they should be fluctuating based on some set of factors, there's also a question of what should the ranges be. So some LP tokens may be range bound relative to other LP tokens, and then have the LP tokens float according to some algorithm. Or it could be that the DAO is constantly revoting in real time by allocating stock somewhere to 2 seeds per BDV, like just some seeds per BDV vote. And maybe both things are in place where the relative rates of seeds per BDV, the rankings of tokens, that may be voted on somehow by the DAO. And as we've spoken about, from a risk management perspective, it may make the most sense to have the DAO set some sort of target exposures. So each token that exists in these LP tokens, USDC, USDT, DAI, USD, whatever, are trading against Beans, the DAO can set certain risk thresholds or desired target allocations to different currencies. And the question then becomes, I guess, assuming it's implemented in that way, how does the DAO vote on those target allocations? And how does the DAO vote on the method of oscillation to target those oscillations? And in the former case, feel like it's probably going to be something like a continuous vote, where people can constantly update their, or maybe it should be, I should say, instead of will be, but it probably should be some sort of continuous vote whereby all stockholders can anytime they want re-update their optimal silo allocation, and then there's some cumulative average across all stockholders' votes in real time, and that's what the system is targeting. And in terms of the method of oscillation of the seeds per BDV to target those silo allocations, that will probably have to be set at a time and then updated via BIP, as opposed to something that's continuously being voted on by the DAO, in the same way that currently the temperature oscillation has a way that it works and has to be updated by a BIP and isn't in real time changing. Although there's always ways to improve the system, and maybe that's the way the oscillation mechanism also moves, where people can change the target magnitudes and times and yada yada. All of that can in theory also be a continuous vote, but would have to give more thought about what's the optimal way to set that up from an incentive perspective.
Sounds like a truly revamped silo, new and improved.
Yeah, so not sure how long it'll take to get all of this stuff up and running, but hopefully Q, I mean, I was going to give a quarter, but hopefully that's like the main mission for 2023 collectively, is we can figure out how this thing works in a perpetual generalized fashion. And then I think maybe along those lines, one really interesting governance question that's related to this is around forks, where if the DAO disagrees on risk allocation or protocol rules or tokens to whitelist, in what cases should there be a fork? In what cases should there not be a fork? How would a fork actually work? These are very interesting questions, but probably something that's also worth considering as the on-chain governance is re-implemented. So perhaps the generalized silo, new version of the silo, that's relatively separate questions from the on-chain governance re-implementation, but in some ways it's obviously related.
Yeah. Okay, Terboy asks Publius if you can summarize maybe in layman terms what are the updates that are in BIP 30.
So, not sure if you're familiar with Pipeline, which is something that was published on chain a couple of weeks ago as part of the Root Paradox product launch. But Paradox and Pipeline and Depot are standalone contracts where Pipeline facilitates or allows for an arbitrary series of function calls in the EVM, and Depot supports wrapping calls to Pipeline to load Pipeline, call Pipeline, and then unload Pipeline. And so in practice, Depot and Pipeline work together to create the ability to perform arbitrary valid actions in the EVM in a single transaction. And that has the potential to improve the user experience in the EVM. Whereas currently you got to do a bunch of different transactions. In theory, from the functionality facilitated from Pipeline and Depot, you can now do almost anything in a single transaction. Now, BIP30, in short, wraps the new Pipeline in a new Depot facet, which is basically a mirror to the standalone Depot contract, which wraps Pipeline. So Pipeline exists, and what BIP30 is, in short, is an implementation of a new Depot facet that wraps Pipeline. Now, there's another substantive change unrelated to Pipeline, which is changing the Sunrise base reward from 100 beans to 25 beans. And the reason for that is that until the Sunrise reward or the Sunrise improvement, which is currently under audit, is ready for proposal, which will probably not be for at least another month, the decrease of the base reward is likely to save Beanstalk something like 60,000 beans over the next month. And in short, it's not expected to have a significant effect on the way the time in which the Sunrise function is called. And again, that's one of the reasons why a new Sunrise function is being implemented, because the current one is so inefficient. But this is sort of a short-term fix to save beans at the margin, something like 60,000 beans. So those are the two main changes proposed in BIP30, and not sure exactly when it expires, but I think it's in the next couple of days.
Yeah, that's on December 8th, and we're around 55% from quorum. Okay, I'll give it a minute, see if folks have questions, or if they would like to.
55% from quorum, meaning that we're not even halfway to quorum.
I think we're more than halfway. So we have 20 million votes. Yeah.
All right. It's participation during the bear market has not been great. And to some extent, this is the point around the forking, which is how to handle non-votes, how to handle votes. Maybe the introduction of forks requires the introduction of no votes in addition to 4 votes, whereas currently you can only vote 4. So lots of interesting questions there. And perhaps while participation should be mandatory, there's certainly a question as to people that disagree with changes and people that agree with changes. There has to be a way for both parties to continue either together or separately without necessarily the complete destruction of the credit history of the protocol, right? So it seems like as it gets harder for changes to be implemented, and the ossification of Beanstalk at the base layer is probably a good thing, there is a question as to making it easy for small factions or even large factions to spin out into their own subset and then maybe over time rejoin back into the main or an older version of Beanstalk. So it's a very interesting, just open-ended question as to how that should work.
Yeah, and I think governance in general, or showing a high turnout for voting is a challenge. We've discussed it, and this is apparent also elsewhere. Anywhere, it's difficult to encourage or have voters vote, even if it costs nothing. Okay, Publius, I have a bit. It's not really a question. It's maybe more of a thought experiment, and I may be confusing here a bit. So bear with me. All right. I'm thinking here of maybe a new tool or a way that Beanstalk can use to, let's say, control the money supply or the supply of beans. And a lot of this is, let's say, inspired by a tool that the Fed uses. So maybe I'll start with what the Fed does, and then how can we mimic or have something similar to that on chain or on Beanstalk. And again, I don't think this is a real idea. It's more of a thought exercise, and let's see where this takes us. So one way or one tool that the Fed uses to control the money supply is interest on reserves, or paying interest on reserves. And the way that the Fed does it is the Fed would tell institutions or banks or whoever that can deposit with the Fed is, if you deposit with us, we will pay you interest on that reserves that you keep with us. And that way, that will discourage, the money to be in circulation, and it will be kept with the Fed. So hence, interest on reserves. The question then comes is, where does the Fed get this money to pay interest, right? And the way the Fed is able to pay that interest is that the Fed holds securities, which is issued, by the Treasury or by the government. And the interest that the Fed receives from those securities that they're holding is the interest that the Fed uses then to pay, that interest on reserves. So far, so good. Let's see, maybe how can we have something similar to that in Beanstalk? And here is my thinking. So let's say
just for completion, does the Fed use the reserves to purchase treasuries that then they return the yield from the treasuries back to the holders of the reserves? Or does the Fed separately hold treasuries and then return the yield from the treasuries that they own to the holders of the reserves in the Fed?
I'm not sure. Maybe I got confused as you're saying. Can you repeat it again?
Sure. So the yield that the Fed is passing on to the depositors of the reserve comes from the treasuries that the Fed holds, correct?
Correct.
Now, is that yield from those treasuries, are those treasuries purchased with the reserves, or are the reserves held separately from the treasuries?
Yeah, so those are separate. The way when the Fed needs to buy, let's say, treasuries or securities, they can just print and buy. So they don't need to use reserves. They don't need to use someone else's money to buy those securities.
So the Fed is so let's just all be on the same page. The Fed is minting money minting dollars to buy treasuries. They're holding treasuries and then passing on some of the yield from the treasuries to the depositors of the reserve in the Fed. But to some extent, they're separate operations.
Correct. That's because they used to do that, and now they don't really do that anymore to control the interest rate, but they still hold a lot of reserves. So they still hold reserves that they can use, and it accumulates interest. Typically, this interest gets returned back to the government. So they don't make interest on it, but they also use that yield nowadays to pay interest on reserves that are held by banks. So it's a more effective tool than buying treasuries on the open market, or to control interest on the open market. Instead of buying bonds on the market, what they do is they just tell the banks, hey, deposit it with us and we'll pay you interest.
Well, it's not necessarily that it's more effective. It's that in an environment where interest rates are already zero, it's hard for the additional purchasing of treasuries to have an effect on interest rates without pushing things into negative interest rate territory, right? So it's not necessarily that the purchasing of the bonds is a weak tool. It's that it seems to have been exhausted, and the payment to the depositors of the reserve is a new or additional complementary or supplementary monetary policy tool to affect people's willingness to hold dollars and assets that qualify as reserves, correct?
Correct. There are a few reasons on why it is let's say a weaker tool for other reasons. But generally speaking, the way that they end up now just controlling the Federal's fund rate is through interest on reserves.
Yes.
Okay, so I guess we drifted a bit, and for good reasons. But the core idea is that one way for you to remove the money supply is to just pay interest on those who will deposit that money that instead would be in circulation with you. So let's think, or one way maybe I'm thinking of how can Beanstalk do that. And again, I don't think it's necessarily a good idea, but maybe we can come up with a good idea.
Maybe just to jump in for a second, feel like the point here is that everybody really wants access to the Fed window, right? That if being your own bank in a world where the Fed is the issuer of the global currency would basically be having your own account at the Fed and getting access to whatever that yield on reserves that currently only select parties have access to. And in Beanstalk's case, everyone already has that ability because they can deposit assets into the silo. So not sure exactly where you want to take this mod, but almost feel like Beanstalk already implements that.
Yes, you're right. And one way they get around, the idea that not everyone can deposit with the Fed is the overnight repurchase agreements. So it's like a workaround around it. They do the same thing. They be like, okay, we're gonna buy it overnight and then we'll sell it again tomorrow with interest. But anyways, the idea that we're taking from this is that one way again for you to remove the money supply is just you pay interest. Or instead of having it circulating, you tell them bring it, keep it with us, and we'll pay interest. We move to Beanstalk, and maybe that will maybe make it more clear. So what if we say that we have a new branch of the silo, or an additional or a separate silo, and that silo tells you that we will pay you a fixed interest rate at the end of the year. And maybe not at the end of the year, at the end of the year with conditions. So it goes on something like this: deposit in that new silo and lock it for 1 year, let's say, and you'll get, I don't know, like 10% or 15% or any arbitrary interest rate. And the way that the silo then will be able to facilitate, the question comes like again, how will Beanstalk be able to pay that rate, or where will it get the money to pay that interest from? And here is what I'm thinking. What if the protocol, whenever the price is above 1, is able to buy back bonds at purchase price? I'm gonna say a lot of things here which may be confusing, but humor me, or bear with me. So if the protocol is able to buy pods at purchase price, so any user, whenever they bought pods at a certain interest rate, they're able to buy back or sell their pods at the amount that they bought it in, only when P is above 1. What happens then is that the protocol holds those bonds. They don't burn them or do anything with them. They keep it with them. And when those pods harvest, when time for harvest comes, then the protocol now has beans that they can use these beans and only then pay that fixed interest, or the interest that I said, after 1 year we're gonna pay you that much. Does that make sense so far? So the same way the Fed holds securities and those securities pay interest, Beanstalk will have pods, and when those pods mature, it will have beans that it's able then to use to pay interest. I'm not sure, by the way, if you're maybe talking, Publius, but you're muted.
Ooh, sorry, Mod. I was muted. Now I don't remember what I was saying. I think I'm with you and understand what you were saying, but economically don't think that it really makes sense. And the the reason for that is, to some extent, what the Fed has going on is very complicated and abstract, and may be deliberately so, or not, but it certainly prevents. It's an abstraction around what's actually going on. So, to me, it makes more sense to bifurcate the two things that you're talking about. One is whether, in certain instances, it may make sense for Beanstalk to buy back pods on the market. And there's a lot of different ways to think about that. One thing that may make sense is anytime pods are sold on the pod market or listed for less than the current temperature, Beanstalk should be willing to buy them and burn them. But don't really like the idea of Beanstalk holding the pods as some sort of form of yield in the form of new beans. Beanstalk can just mint beans whenever it wants. So doesn't like the distribution of the bean mints can be done in a much more elegant way than being dependent on how many pods Beanstalk has been able to buy on the secondary, if that makes sense. So it's like it becomes an abstraction, and it actually prevents Beanstalk from acting in the most optimal way. So to me, it makes much more sense to keep the treatment of pods, even if Beanstalk is starting to act on the secondary market, totally separate from the payment of yield to the silo, at least in my opinion.
No, I think I do agree. Besides the complexity as well, I'm just not sure if this new facility will be attractive, anyways. But even if it is, there is a lot of complexity in it, as you said. Okay, that's all from my end, and I think we're at the end of the town hall. Actually, we are not. Okay, we have a few questions here. So, Guy asks, and they're going back to the idea of the forking, or if we face a situation where DAO members disagree, let's say, and they want to fork. So, Guy asks, how could that work even in theory, given that beans derive their value from the assets that Beanstalk can't mint?
I don't really know what that means.
Yeah, I think what they're saying is, let's say right now we have bean 3 curve, and then we fork. Who gets the 3 curve? Because you can't fork the 3 curve.
So there's really a couple different parties in the system. There's pod holders, depositors, and fertilizer holders or sprout holders. And what you'd expect is for a BIP to be specified whether it is a fork, like a hard fork or not, in which case, if there's no hard fork, it probably is okay to still have the 4 votes only. But if it is going to be a hard fork, then you probably need a second class or a third class of votes introduced, where it's a no vote is neutral, a 4 vote is a vote for, and a no vote is a vote to keep the current system. And think that in the case of a hard fork, everyone would have to vote, or if not vote, select, opt into a system. And in practice, that is voting, whereby all of the deposits associated with the stock, and in the world where stock is liquid, not clear exactly how that works, would have to choose a version. Similarly, the sprouts would have to choose a version, and the pods would have to choose a version. In the case where you don't vote, that is really the most interesting question, whether your value gets split, whether you retain value on both chains. Very unclear, because then there's an incentive not to vote at all. Yeah, very, very, very interesting question. And some value you can't keep on both versions, obviously.
Do you know, or are you aware of a protocol or something similar that happened and they continued in different paths? I guess there are a few examples, but can you think of one that is similar, maybe to our situation, or one that to look for inspiration when it comes to something like that? That hey, they did it the good way or the right way, and others maybe they did not.
Well, I feel like the ETH DAO hack was really probably the best example that comes to mind. Maybe Bitcoin Cash with the Bitcoin block wars, but both of those are L1s, and so the question kind of becomes around how to create the most decentralized forking mechanism within the EVM. And as we've seen with the latest ETH fork or the hard fork to go to proof of stake, the centralized issuers of value on chain ended up really being the deciding factor on where value was retained, and feel like a good decentralized governance mechanism with forking within the EVM should facilitate people to choose or accounts to choose in a much more decentralized fashion than at the top down a version being selected. So there's a lot of opportunity here to make radical improvements to current governance, but there's also a lot of inspiration to be taken from how current L1s work.
Okay. Tyler B asks, and Safi and Guy, let me know if this answered your questions. If it wasn't, we can expand more on the forking question. Tyler B asks, Bean has been off peg for a while. Is that a concern? Nobody seems to be buying soil right now. Is that a problem for the protocol? And if that's the case, then do you think there are things that we can do to improve the state of Beanstalk?
So these are hard questions to answer. On the one hand, concern is really an opinion. Beanstalk has autonomous ways to respond to its conditions. Concern, angst, any sort of emotion is not part of the Beanstalk equation. If you're asking what we think, Beanstalk has experienced much more significant deviations from peg in terms of magnitude and time, at least so far in Beanstalk's history, and therefore this doesn't seem particularly out of the ordinary. Obviously, there's no way to know, but with that said, there's also not too many beans that actually exist such that there is some floor price to beans right now, and frankly, it's hard to speak more substantively about that because don't want to say everything's great when things are off peg, and even when things are on peg, don't feel it's appropriate to say things are great. There are lots of concerns and lots of things that can be improved, and the short-term deviations are evidence of what may be working and not working, but beyond that, try not to get too focused on the short term. With regards to the question around, is it a problem that no one's buying soil? In practice, yes, it is a problem. And Beanstalk is responding to that problem by raising the temperature. We would argue that, and in response to your third question, if that is the case, what do you think we should do to improve the state of Beanstalk? Feel like the wells is something that a lot of people are waiting for, but that won't necessarily contribute to peg maintenance. Feel like Silo V3 with a gauge system, even if it's a rough gauge system, that's probably the next big thing that will have a dramatic effect on peg maintenance, and further improve the economics of Beanstalk. So that's probably Q1, Q2, and in the meantime, don't really anticipate a dramatic improvement or decrease in performance from the protocol. But at this point, hard to do much other than just keep building, and there's a lot to build.
I also think it's interesting that there is a lot of, if we want to call it, gunpowder to get back to peg, but it seems to be that this is now by choice. Silo depositors or bean holders, they choose, or they're happy maybe not happy, but content, let's say, with the current peg or price.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Okay, we are at the end of the town hall chat. Let's maybe give it a minute and see if we have more questions. Okay, thank you all for joining us today. And as a reminder, BIP30 is currently live for voting. So if you didn't, please participate or vote. Publius, thank you for your time, and we'll see you all next week.